Yeah, so I'm very happy that Mark Cederberg has joined us. He's been an active member of all these discussions that we've had on the Living Shorelines uh, projects. And Mark is a restoration specialist, particularly in the practicalities of construction and getting things done, with a long history of innovative projects and using innovative construction techniques around the Bay to work in these particular ecosystems. So Mark's going to talk about debris management, and which I'm sure is a subject dear to all our hearts. And so without further ado, Mark, can you take it?
Yes, thank you. Well,
Great. And I have your slide here, Mark, whenever,
oh
if you
yeah.
want me to.
Oh, cool. There's a background to it. I like it. Anyway, yeah, not a lot of pretty pictures to show with debris when it comes to talking about debris, but I appreciate the fact that this is I want to, say that this is a critical part of every project when it comes to even initial considerations. I mean, it's one of the things that can lead to it can affect your design from early on. And the Estuary Park project's a great example of the fact that there's debris, there's hazardous material in the ground, so it's got to stay. So then the debris has to stay, and then they've got creative ways to reuse the debris that is there. And so, I laid this out with the idea that I would follow this in order, but actually I'm going to bounce around a little bit and try to make it move along pretty quickly. So, um, the I'm going to put a pin in concrete because we're going to come back to that. But I'm going to go to basically the debris that I list below that, where you've got asphalt, steel, creosote, pressure treated lumber. Lost the slide there. Okay, no worries. And the bottom line is there's certain types of debris that basically, if they're on the surface and part of and you recognize them as part of your project, in your project area early on, generally they have to go. Unless it's a site that has to be capped and the material has to stay in place in order to not disturb it. Commonly, these things like asphalt, it's got to go because it'll leach oil for a long time. Steel's got to go for safety reasons typically, and that's easy to take care of. It can be recycled. And then creosote and pressure treated lumber, again, ongoing problems for contamination, and they have to go. So the things that those aren't as much of a question. But then when you kind of taking it back to concrete, and then I'll put other debris in that category, generally things that are considered inert or not necessarily hazardous or toxic. That's where the questions come in. And most commonly, and of course in urban areas around the Bay, you see concrete. It's so common, and it's because it's been used as a revetment. And a lot of times it can be on the surface, can also be buried in your site. It may not be on the surface, which is why I encourage folks to always do investigation of any sort of fill area that is historic fill to see what is there. Because again, that can affect the design pretty early on. And so I want to basically focus the discussion, and I will say I've got a lot of notes here, and I'm happy to share that with people as well afterwards, because I've got notes on like considerations for each type of debris that might be useful. But I want to talk about concrete primarily because concrete comes down to, if it's not automatically going offsite, if your site doesn't have a net cut, then the question around concrete is it a resource or is it waste? And that question usually is decided by cost and logistics, and logistics being like kind of interchangeable with cost, because the more difficult things are to do, the more expensive it's going to be to manage. So on the concrete, and so now I'll talk a little bit about like how to, management of concrete itself. So I've broken it down into kind of some ways to consider it when you uncover it, or when it's on your site, or whether you're intending to remove it or just simply do something with it, whether it's remove it or work with it. And again, these are considerations for cost. So if you have large chunks of concrete, as look like some photos on the estuary project were the case, then the only way to handle it is to break it. And when you start breaking it, typically you're going to find rebar in it. And when you find rebar in it, that means now you've got to cut the rebar. And if you're reusing it on site, you have to trim it for safety. If you're hauling it off, the concrete must be broken into small enough pieces that it can be actually accepted by a recycle facility, and that includes trimming the rebar down to basically within a couple inches of the edge of the concrete chunks. If the concrete is already broken into small pieces and there's rebar sticking out, typically has to be trimmed. And when you're disposing of concrete off-site, the disposal facilities, it's very important to check with local disposal facilities as to the condition of that concrete and how it needs to be processed for them to receive it. And because it varies by site. So that really covers disposal and the reuse of material on site. Again, breaking it to small pieces. In the Estuary Park project, it looked like there was a consideration of reuse, which required breaking into small pieces. And again, that might require trimming rebar, making sure it's safe if it ever is exposed. But also one of the things that can be done with concrete is it could be incorporated into backing. Generally, people don't want to see it on the surface, but it can be incorporated as backing for shoreline revetment. But it also, if you're, say, using rock, but it also can be crushed and reused on site. If you have a tremendous amount of concrete on site, above several hundred yards at least, it can be crushed and reused as base material for, say, a park project. If you're working along a shoreline, you're building trails or whatever, that material can be reused. And the key factor with all of this is it's very important to do before you assume it's easy to reuse or easy to process for reuse. Or easy to remove, or you decide you must remove it. It's really important to do essentially a cost analysis of those options, because often that'll dictate what you do with it. So it's nice to consider reusing on site, but the process or the requirements for processing the material on site could make it cost prohibitive. Also, it could be that it's much more cost effective to reuse it on site or to process it on site for reuse, or even to process it for disposal if you're dealing with very large quantities of concrete in the thousands of yards, and it actually then becomes less expensive to even crush it before hauling it off site. So again, all of that is typically dictated by costs, construction costs, or the cost of managing the materials. And most of the time, those things can be determined very early on. These are all market-based. They're market-based costs for concrete, and the process, there's no secret to how concrete is processed. So again, that's one of the reasons why I think it's really important that you address your debris composition as early as possible through potholing on your site, historical records of what the site was used for, and that can inform the feasibility of your project budgets, funding requests, all of that, again, early in the process, in the conceptual phase. It could also affect, like I said, your finished design. So I'm going to jump then. Again, like I said, I've got lots of notes that I can share. But one of the last things on concrete debris is that oftentimes it's important not just, and this is specific to concrete, like I said, asphalt, creosote, those things are typically considered, required to be removed if they're exposed. So, but one of the things with concrete is to take a look at the debris composition and determine whether there's any ACM concrete, in other words, asbestos-containing material. Oftentimes around the shorelines in the bay, you'll find old transite pipe, which is the asbestos was essentially used to reinforce the concrete instead of mesh. So it could be a pretty serious consideration if it's mixed in. Not necessarily a big deal as long as it can be separated, because if it's a small quantity, your typical contractor can handle quantities under 100 square feet by law. So they can just bag and remove the material to a disposal facility. If it's a large quantity, of course, you have to get company to handle that. And that goes with the pressure treated material as well. Somebody specialized or licensed has to handle it. So again, just to make sure, moving things along here, a couple things I noted for consideration outside of the type of debris is the things to consider in terms of debris removal logistics. And some of the most important things when it comes to handling debris removal is that the contractors, that you make a consideration for adequate staging for the contractor. And what that means is that if you are dealing with a lot of debris and you have to, it always is going to require sorting or processing, and you need significant areas on your project site to make sure that your construction contractor can sort and handle and truck or transport sorted debris. Debris will always require sorting if you're hauling it off site. Facilities are always going to take different types of debris, and you can't just throw it all in a truck and take it to one place. The equipment for this type of work typically varies, or I should say, varies a little bit. It's often if it's smaller quantities of debris, or the debris is already broken into small pieces, you can use the equipment that you would use, that the contractors use the same equipment that they use for everything else on the site. But one of the things to consider with construction when you're working with debris is noise. And again, in the conceptual phase, the planning phase, when you're permitting, is you want to make sure you've accounted for the amount of racket you're going to make breaking material up. Especially, it's similar to dumping and spreading rock. The debris is going to be, it's especially like jackhammering, sawing, cutting. You're doing hot work, cutting rebar, all of that, and then with the breakage and dumping, it's going to be very, very loud. And then finally, a really important consideration, and oftentimes this will dictate what you actually decide to do, and it's really important early on, is really this all comes down to costs. Again, most of what you do with the debris, besides things that you have to manage based on the nature of the material, like if it's hazardous or not, is going to be based on your ability to pay for whatever it is you decide to do with it. And key consideration with that, and there's a process to go through, is first step is just, can you leave it on site, or can you work with it on site? That's going to be the least expensive way to manage it. The second piece is, can you reuse it or process it and reuse it on site as a beneficial reuse of the material? The third is, if you do remove all the material, do you leave a void that then has to be backfilled by something else? That's a cost too. And then finally, making sure that whatever you decide to do with it, you have adequate space to manage it, and you account for that early on in the logistics and planning process. So, like I said, I had a lot more than that. I could talk about this all day, but I'll stop there and just kind of say, if you want to have a discussion about it, I'm happy to answer questions here. And I'm also happy to share, like I said, all the notes on each type of debris and what you want to do with it afterwards.